We have heard the cries of the children and seen the images from inside the detention centers at the border where children are being separated from their parents. Does this amount to child abuse? The White House says no.
We have high standards. We give them meals. We give them education. We give them medical care. There's videos. There's TVs. I visited the detention centers myself. That would be my answer to that question.
Joining us now, Dr. Colleen Kraft, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and Antar Davidson, a former shelter employee turned whistleblower. Dr. Kraft, I want to start with you. You heard the response from the Secretary of Homeland Security on the question of whether this is child abuse. What did you make of her answer, and what's your view?
I think that one has to understand what's foundational in building child health. And that is the relationship with a nurturing adult, with a caring parent. And apart from that, you can have the most beautiful surroundings and food and water and shelter and games. But if you don't have a parent, if you don't have that adult who cares for that child, you're taking away what's foundational and what's most important to that child's health. And so taking a child away from a parent is child abuse.
You have visited the border. You have been to these shelters. What is the long-term impact of this separation on a child? And we've heard accounts of them being anywhere from 6 months old to 11.
So particularly for very young children, the body has its own stress response where you see increases in cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine, the fight or flight hormones. And in the presence of an adult who can help to buffer those hormones, you have a child who can get upset, but then can be calmed down, whose needs can be met, and they can become resilient. When that buffer is taken away, when you no longer have that parent to calm or console, then you have a situation that's called toxic stress. And toxic stress is prolonged exposure to these fight or flight hormones, and it actually disrupts the architecture of the brain in these children as they're developing. So you have long-term damage in their social emotional bonding, in their speech, in their language, their ability to learn, and eventually it becomes a risk factor for chronic health conditions.
Antar, you worked in a shelter in Tucson until last week. You quit. Why?
Well, officially, I felt that the direction the organization was taking was ultimately one that was very damaging to the children, especially considering the fact that these kids are being placed directly into public schools upon reunification. It's easy for a person on an official visit being shown by the organization itself to determine that the facility is nice. It's a different thing to basically work there day in and day out. You can't determine the widespread treatment. You have so many interactions, so many facilities, so many employees that on one visit to unequivocally say that everything is fine is quite a stretch.
What did you see from these children? What was their behavior like after being in these shelters, Antar?
Well, prior to the zero tolerance policy, the kids were a lot better. It was a lot better behaved. The kids that came mostly were prepared for the journey. They came knowing prior that they would spend some time in the shelter and then they would ultimately be reunified. So for that reason, they were much more calm. As in the past 6 weeks, however, the kids were not those kids. It was not the same population. There began to show up kids that did not have being in the shelter in mind. They didn't know what was happening. They were kids who had just been ripped from their parents. And so for that reason, were extremely distressed and showing a lot of traumatized behavior, symptoms of trauma.
I want to play what Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen said about respecting the workers at the border, the people interacting with these children. Let's listen.
We take allegations of mistreatment seriously, and I want to stress this point. We investigate. We hold those accountable when and if it should occur. We have some of the highest detention standards in the country. Claiming these children and their parents are treated inhumanely is not true and completely disrespects the hardworking men and women at the Office of Refugee Resettlement.
So you can see what she's trying to do there, Dr. Kraft. She's trying to suggest that the people questioning this policy are pointing the finger at the men and women who are working at the border there. But it's your contention, Dr. Kraft, that even if these are the best caregivers in the world, it won't make up for the separation from the parent.
That's absolutely right. And in the shelter that I visited, the staff and the workers were actually very kind people. They were not allowed to hold and console these young children, but they really tried to give them toys and crayons, and they were as kind as they could possibly be. That's still no substitute for having a parent, because particularly these very young children who are not quite verbal yet can't express what's going on there, and the person that they need the most is their mother or father, that person that they've known all along who's been able to console and comfort them.
2,000 kids who can't be held by a parent or anyone else right now, separated from their families. It could all stop with a phone call from the president. Dr. Colleen Kraft, Antar Davidson, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have
Nice. Thank you for having me.